Well, good to see you again.
You too. How have you been?
I've been good. I've been looking you up, of course, on the internet, and I see that from your LinkedIn page, you were a volunteer at the symphony from 2016. So that's 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was. It seems like it was just yesterday.
So how are things for you?
Things are going well. I've been working for the Academy of Vocal Arts for over a year now, and I do that. And then on the side, I also run my business as well.
Just what's your background, Stephen? I mean, if you could just give a little bit about where you grew up, what your educational background is.
I grew up in Lake Ariel, Pennsylvania, which is about 30 miles northeast of Scranton. And if anybody knows that from watching The Office, Lake Ariel was really tough area to get involved in music in. There was not a whole lot to do, but when I started getting involved in music in the Scranton area, that's when things really started to take off. Especially when I got into high school and I became part of several bands. I became part of a band called the Ringgold Pops, which as a trumpet player was a whole lot of fun. The band did a lot of 4th of July things, and we were doing festivals all the time, primarily the Italian festival that came up in Scranton once a year. That's when I started to really meet other musicians and getting to understand what it was like to be a professional in the music industry. But the problem that I had was that every musician, every professional musician was also a teacher. So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do as a career, the only thing that I knew was that any professional musician was a teacher. So I went in the direction of music education. I got accepted to Marywood University in Scranton, and I got my bachelor's degree there. I started off as a music education major. And as I started doing the observations and the student teaching sides of that, I started to really question why I was there. I didn't really get any kind of benefit for myself. I didn't get any kind of fulfillment from being in the classroom. It wasn't until I got a job as an assistant band director for my old high school that I realized that I'm in the wrong place. I was teaching students about history and the music and really trying to get them to understand the theory and everything behind the music, but they were there to just play music and have fun. And I was getting so frustrated. And that's when I realized that education is not the direction that I want to go. At this point, I had already gone to the Midwest Band and Orchestra Clinic. I started to realize that there are more things out in this world that somebody in the music world can do other than education. So I actually started thinking about going into conducting. When I got back, I had a teacher that I went to that said, if you're interested in conducting, why don't you take an independent study with me and we will set up a class and we can start from there. And so in all of my assignments in that independent study, he started giving me history assignments. And I started getting more involved into the history rather than the conducting. So when I realized that education wasn't the thing that I wanted to do, I switched to music performance because I knew that music performance is going to be a better route for me to get into rather than education to become a music historian or musicologist. I actually switched in my senior year. For that year, I finished all of my requirements as a performance major and graduated, and then tried to get into music history programs for my master's degree. Then I got accepted to Temple University, where I got my music history degree in May 2019.
As you were recounting your educational background, I was wondering if there are people who you consider to be mentors, people who had such an impact on you that you wouldn't be where you are today had they not been part of your background.
Probably the biggest mentor that I had, at least when I really got into college, was Dr. Nathaniel Parker. He was the orchestra director at Marywood. When I became a senior, he got accepted to a position at Kennesaw State University. When I moved to Atlanta, we reconnected, and he was always one of the greatest supporters of everything that I ever did. He was probably the biggest mentor I had while I was really discovering myself in my educational background.
For those who don't know, what is musicology?
Musicology is really the study of music. Musicology can be broken down into two major portions, which is the music theory and the music history. Musicology is really trying to understand the history, the psychology, the philosophy behind the music that one may be studying, or trying to get across that to other people. I have a degree in music history, which is just one small portion under what musicology is. While I primarily focused on the history, of course, I also was kind of fortunate enough to be able to study the philosophy and what a composer was going through mentally, and what theorists and philosophers at the time were trying to understand along with the composer.
Did you studying some of the ways that people analyze music, for example, Schenker and
I did. I did have to take several theory courses. I did study Schenker. I didn't study many other theorists. Probably the only other theory that I took was major composers who also dabbled in other people's theory, or who were trying to create a new kind of theory, such as Schoenberg or Bartók, and their ideas and what they were trying to convey in their music, or trying to capture what music was like during their time.
is there some value in the regular music lover's experience to be derived from musical theory?
Music theory certainly would be a benefit to those who are really into classical music. But once you start understanding the theory behind something, you start to hear things a little bit differently. You don't just hear it for the art, you hear it for the passion that was behind the composer, understanding what it was that the composer was trying to get across. If you have a basic understanding of music theory, then you get a chance to be able to see a little bit deeper into the composers that you really love. If you take a look at maybe, for example, a Tchaikovsky score, specifically even Tchaikovsky 6. If you knew the theory behind the introduction to Tchaikovsky 6 Symphony, it means a whole lot more. In that symphony, particularly, if you look at it, there is a series of notes that symbolizes a theme that he uses in many other pieces, which he used in Romeo and Juliet, which he would term his star-crossed lover theme. So if you were able to understand a little bit of theory, you would be able to pick up on that and then be able to also understand things that the composer might have used in other things, or even that other composers might have adapted. So yes, I think that having at least a basic understanding of music theory would help anybody who is really an avid classical music listener.
All right, good answer. I don't think there's anything inherent in music that across people result in the same kind of emotional experience.
Exactly.
Rather, the emotionality comes out of my experience and my associations with the music.
Exactly. Music is such a subjective art. A composer is putting their own life into this piece of music, but every single person has their own experiences and their own life that once they go and witness this piece of art, they're not going to hear it the same way that anybody else is. They have their own experiences to project upon the music, and vice versa. The music is projecting something onto the person that the person may not know about or have ever experienced. So some things that the composer or the interpreter might be trying to get across doesn't get across to every single person because not everybody experiences the same things. So I completely agree with
All
that.
right. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the influence of being woke in understanding classical music that sometimes takes the form of saying that it's part of the white male patriarchy, saying, for example, that Beethoven was the greatest composer is simply a reflection of a white male's view of
Mhm.
music. Wondered if any of that influenced your education.
Yes, I think when I was specifically going through my music history degree, there was a significant amount of professors telling us which composers were the best. And they were always the dead white man. They limited themselves very much to Beethoven and Brahms. And they hardly ever explored or compared anything to any other composer, which it became quite frustrating because we wanted to see other things. We wanted to see how history influenced other people's music and how other people were influenced by. And it wasn't until I got to my final semester when I took History of Opera 2 that something changed a little bit, where we started talking about operas that were composed by other races and other nationalities that were not within the standard canon. I think the first major point where that all switched was when we started talking about Scott Joplin's Treemonisha. And how Treemonisha was designed to be this melting pot of different cultures, and then how the world at the time viewed Treemonisha, and how people flocked to Gershwin's Porgy and Bess over Treemonisha because it was a white man composing a piece of music for black people rather than a African American black composer composing for his own race and nationality. And that was when I started to realize that there's so much more than Beethoven and Brahms. We can certainly learn from them, but their time is over. Their their time is up, and they're they may have been the greatest composers of their time, but they're no longer the greatest of all time.
Any effort to talk about greatest is really doomed to failure unless you're really
Right.
specific about what your criteria are. And one of the things that has concerned me about some of the woke analysis of music, when they criticize saying that Beethoven is the greatest, he's the greatest maybe within a particular theoretical framework
Right.
about music.
Hmm.
One of the great things about the European influence in music is not only the notation system, but also understanding the effects of sound. The scores reflect sounds, and they had to understand the sounds first and the relationship
Right.
between one note, for example, or one tone and another tone. And that's the greatness. And what Beethoven and others like Brahms capitalized on. But if I were to apply those same criteria to, say, music from India, it would be a non-starter.
Right.
There, there are great composers in India, but they're based on a different system
Right.
of understanding music.
Right.
So obviously, when you say Beethoven was the greatest, it's under the assumption that these are the criteria that you're using to make that judgment. But I think you're right. There's a
Yes.
whole world of music outside of not only Western art music, but even within Western art music, there are certainly lots
Right.
of epicenters of greatness.
I do agree with that. I think there is something that is a little bit lost when it is a white man trying to use this system in their own music. Somebody who hasn't lived with it, somebody who hasn't grown up with that music, as opposed to somebody who is Indian or who is Japanese and using their systems, and as somebody who knows the system like the back of their hand,
Yeah.
who has lived it, who has experienced it their whole life. I think there is something just a little bit lost when it goes through somebody who hasn't experienced it. That goes the same for when you write it down as well, and you put your own emotions and your own understandings into a piece of music.
But taking it outside of the perspective of the old white male, because I'm an old white male, but if you think of Chinese composers who have adopted Western conventions in
Mhm.
music composition, and I really get what you're saying, because sometimes I think they fail. It isn't as easy to integrate musical cultures as one might think. Another
Right.
example of that is whenever I go to see a symphony orchestra and I see a rock band in the middle of it with a drum stand, and it
Right.
makes me shudder because I don't think anybody has successfully integrated those two kinds of musical traditions. One is
Hmm.
always tacked on to the other, but there's never a full integration uh,
Right.
for any number of reasons.
Right.
So it's just not a cultural, racial thing. It's actually a musical style thing. And your point about
Right.
if you haven't lived it, you may not be able to do it. And I think that's
Right.
it's an excellent point. And maybe we're asking too much for that actually to happen. Do you have particularly favorite composers?
Yes, I am a huge Tchaikovsky fan. I There is just something about Tchaikovsky's music that is just unparalleled to me. I have a very strong connection to his music emotionally. I think that's the biggest reason why I love his music so much. But it's really hard for me to try and to claim somebody as my favorite beyond Tchaikovsky because I love so many composers. I think that every single composer has their own unique voice, and it's hard to say, ooh, that's my favorite. But yeah, I would have to say that Tchaikovsky is absolutely my top favorite composer.
You've created your podcast,
I
and it's
did.
been up and running now since when?
Since the end of April of
And
2020.
it's called,
The Composer Chronicles.
right. When you set about producing it, is everything scripted? When you're, for example, when you talk about Rachmaninoff and his depression and so on,
Right.
have you written that all down, or is that extemporaneous?
The major episodes, the 20-minute historical episodes, are all scripted. The more I do them, the more improvisation comes along in the recording process. I do write everything down, but as I'm recording, there are moments where I insert my own understanding about something, or I try to emphasize something and I change the sentence, and for a moment I just close my eyes and don't read the script. But yes, everything is already written down. As I progress, I am floating a little bit further and further away from them, but yes.
And then I assume you go back and edit once you've recorded it.
I do. This is such a new thing for me. I've never really done anything where I sit in front of a microphone and talk. So I stumble a lot. I I will read a word and question myself, especially when I'm dealing with certain names. I get to a name, and despite having repeated it in my head a million times, trying to say it just doesn't work. I press record on my program. I use Audacity, and I just let it run until the script is ended. And then I go back, and if I had to repeat a sentence, then I edit that out. Or if I had to cough for a moment, then that gets taken out. But there are things that I have said or have regretted saying that I go back in, I edit out, and I re-record, and then I insert it back in, just because I felt that there was a better way to say something. There is quite a bit of editing in the background, despite having a script in front of me.
What's your goal for the podcasts?
So my goal for the podcasts have been to get those who have been interested in understanding classical music, and to be able to show that these composers are not as glorious as we make them out to be. They're just human beings that had their lives, they had their mistakes and their fumbles, and they all face the same issues that we face every day in a varied form. But my goal is to make sure that those who don't understand composers and classical music get a chance to really know who the composer was, and see that these composers are just people. Right now, I'm sure that all of my listeners are people who love classical music, but I hope that it will eventually evolve into something where people who are not classical music enthusiasts will find it and say, I would really like to know more about these people and learn something from them.
Do you see yourself in the mold of a Bernstein, for example?
I think so. I run into the problem with the podcasting format of not being able to show the music and be able to show people, okay, this is what I'm talking about in this part of the music. Although I don't really talk about the music itself as in a theoretical standpoint. I usually focus more on the composer themselves and how the piece fit into their life. I am starting to run a monthly segment where I introduce living composers. In each of those episodes, I ask that composer, can you send me a piece of music for me to use at the end of my episode, no more than 15 minutes, so that the listener gets a chance to hear a piece of music that you wrote after we talked to you for an hour. And for the most part, they have all been very willing to send me a piece of music. So in that segment, I do get to use music written by the composer, because they themselves have their own, they have their rights, that they have pieces of music that they can share with me. But there are times where the composer has said to me, I can't send you the piece of music that you would want me to, what you would want to use, because it's, the rights are also extended to the performing group or to the record
Right.
label. I am using some composers' music, but it would be the ones that are currently living and are able and have the rights to be able to tell me that they can use this music. So any music in the main episodes is just background music. It has no association to the composer unless I can find a piece of music in the, I use a program called Epidemic Sound, which I get the rights to just, it's just a library of music where composers get to send stuff. Every once in a while, I'll be able to find a recording of something. For example, I was able to find a recording of a string quartet of Nimrod, and so I was able to use that in my Elgar episode, or some music from a different Mozart opera or string quartet, and use that in my Mozart episode. But there isn't really a whole lot that I can do at the moment in terms of, I'm talking about Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, so here is a recording of this particular moment.
Where can people access your podcast?
It is accessible on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, Breaker. There's a whole bunch of other ones. But you can, if you have a podcast platform that isn't any of those, you can go to my website, which is alexandrianmedia.org, and then go down to the Composer Chronicles on the menu, and you'll be able to find all of the podcast platforms to listen.
And do you have an associated Patreon account?
I do. I have a Patreon account, which is patreon.com/Stephen J. Trygar. Members of my Patreon page get access to a member-only podcast called Unscripted, which is me going back through the whole month and explaining the whole month, why I chose the music that I chose. I may mention a little bit more about a piece of music that I didn't get to mention or didn't fit within the episode. Now that I'm talking to live composers, I get to share a little bit of snippets in that I removed from the main episode and share a little bit more insight into the composer I'm talking to. Also, members of my Patreon page get ad-free episodes of each of the episodes, and they also get early access to those ad-free episodes at 5 o'clock on the Tuesday prior of when the main episode will air. So in terms of the podcast, that's what members get, and that starts at $1.50 a month.
So far, are you pleased with your audience reach?
I am. I'm very surprised how many that I have gotten. The moment that I started introducing interviews and talking to live people, that's when things started to change. I started getting a lot more audience members. I'm pulling in people from the composers following or the interviewees following. And I also, because I started doing music for film music and for video game music as well, I'm getting people who are interested in those things, realizing that movie music and video game music that we find in our current culture, those composers were influenced by people like Stravinsky and Debussy, and they're not that far away from each other. They're still composers who were influenced by other composers to write the music that you hear in your movie. I'm still only under 20 episodes.
On the topic of movie music, Prokofiev was a great composer of movie
Hmm.
soundtracks.
Yeah.
And out of his soundtracks, he specifically developed suites
Yes.
that can be played in the concert hall.
Right.
Today, most of the composers of it don't care.
Right.
So we end up with the actual soundtrack itself, which is a bunch of clips.
Right. As film itself develops, it demands more things that are specific to it. Music in the background that aids in the emotional component rather than just put music in that as a background. It will hopefully fit. Prokofiev specifically, because he was a composer of so many different genres, that's what he knew. And so being introduced into film, he was writing what he knew. So he was writing things that were similar to his ballets and to his other suites. And I think that's what really helps a listener of his movie music suites to be able to not have to see the visual counterpart. But nowadays, if you're watching a movie, John Williams, it gets a little bit more difficult, especially with the background music, because they wrote the music after having watched the movie. I recently had a interview with a film composer, Ben Morales Frost, whose episode will be next, who talked about that and how he gets the music, he writes down some of the music to be able to give to the filmmakers, but he doesn't finish anything until he gets the score back because the filmmakers want something that specifically follows their movie. And I think with somebody like Prokofiev or even Korngold, they were composing the music like alongside the filmmakers, and they didn't really have the chance of being able to watch the film and then compose. And so, but at the same time, they were also composers of other things like operas and ballets. So that's where they get their where they get their inspiration from, and that's where their sound comes from.
Sure, that makes sense. Kubrick was something of an anomaly
Mm-hmm.
because he would often use classical music rather than having original music composed, for example, with Ligeti.
Right.
And so he inserted that in the movie rather than having original music played. What do you think the status of classical music in America is, given our increasing diversity and given that classical music is, as you've mentioned, defined as a dead white man's
Yes.
exercise? What's your predictions for the future?
There are so many composers that are living now that are aiming to get classical music to a younger audience, and not even composers but organizations that are aiming to get younger people and other various social groups involved. It's really, sometimes it can be just disheartening to watch the reaction. I remember an audience member coming up to me when I worked for the Philadelphia Orchestra saying, "Why is Philadelphia Orchestra performing Nico Muhly's new suite for Marnie? I don't want to hear this. I'm here for the Brahms piano concerto." And my response was, we have to further our understanding of music. We have to support the composers who are living and not just focus on the past, which is really interesting for a music historian to say that we shouldn't dawdle on the past. But I think that music for the future is still quite bright. I think that we have so many organizations and composers and musicians who want new music, who want to be able to push that forward, that there there is hope. I know that like the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra performs new music all the time, and the Atlanta audience seems to be a little bit more receptive to that.
Absolutely right. That's one of the great things that Maestro Spano has accomplished in Atlanta, to
Yes,
train the ear of the audience.
right.
That will be his great legacy.
It's a matter of just acquainting that music with that audience, just continuing to remind people that this music is here, and over time people will accept it a little bit more. So it's not always atonal. New music can be quite beautiful, and I think if listeners of classical music, specifically new classical music, just puts aside their their understanding of what new music is, they could further what everybody else is trying to get across. I think audiences are becoming more willing to listen to it. I know what it was like going from Atlanta to Philadelphia, where Philadelphia Orchestra, the audience is known for trying to keep tradition as long as they can. And going from Atlanta, who was performing a new work nearly every other week, to an orchestra that performed Beethoven and Brahms every performance, was a cultural shock for me, despite only having been in Atlanta for just 1 year. Now Philadelphia is becoming a little bit more accepting of new music. I think Yannick is pushing that, is pushing these new works into Philadelphia, and it's finally starting to settle in. And not just the Philadelphia Orchestra, but Opera Philadelphia performing new works all the time, and all the various groups around Philadelphia area performing more and more new works, that Philadelphia is becoming a place where new music is also becoming just the norm.
One final question,
Sure.
as they say. What do you think we've learned out of the pandemic?
That no matter what, we will still find ways to make art. There is such a demand for art and for entertainment that there's no way that our music can die. We will always be able to find new ways, no matter what is thrown at us, to be able to share our talents with other people. The pandemic hasn't really hindered anything at all. It has just made the art a little bit more broad and stronger, to show us that there are new things that we can do. There are new ways we can share our art with the world.
Well, I certainly have kept you long enough.
It's quite all right. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for asking.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. You take care.
You too. Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.